Imagine you're wearing a t-shirt right now, and if you're not, congratulations, but please put one on for this analogy. That shirt you're wearing, the cotton grown in India, the synthetic dyes manufactured in Germany, the stitching done in Bangladesh, and the massive logistical miracle that got it to your front door, was made possible by a $33 trillion invisible web. But here's the disturbing fact. 98% of that $33 trillion global trade network is governed by a single, highly bureaucratic referee operating out of a quiet, unassuming building in Geneva. And here is the kicker. That referee is currently fundamentally broken. You probably think the global economy is just a free market governed by the natural laws of supply, demand, and the occasional midnight tweet from a tech billionaire. It's not. It is rigidly governed by the World Trade Organization, the WTO. Right now, the WTO is a 166-member club where sovereign nations aggressively fight over tariffs, manipulate international rules, and legally sanction each other in ways that directly dictate the price of your groceries, your electronics, and your car. It is a system built on mutual distrust, held together by thousands of pages of legal text. In this video, we're going to completely tear the lid off the WTO. We aren't looking at the PR brochures. We are looking at the brutal mechanics of how global trade actually works, why the WTO's Supreme Court has been deliberately paralyzed by the United States since 2019, and how the entire modern world relies on a system that current data suggests is hanging by a remarkably thin thread. Buckle up. This is how the WTO actually works. 1. The Ghost of Bretton Woods, or How to Prevent World War III with Spreadsheets. Let's play a quick game of historical roleplay. The year is 1930. You're an American farmer or factory worker, and the global economy is currently cratering into what will soon be known as the Great Depression. You are terrified. So your government decides to do what governments usually do best when they panic. They build a wall, not a physical one, but a financial one. Enter the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. To protect domestic jobs, the US government slapped massive import duties on over 20,000 foreign goods. The logic was simple, politically seductive, and completely wrong. If we make foreign stuff too expensive to buy, Americans will have to buy American stuff and our economy will be saved. Here is where the data provides the shock value. What actually happened? The exact opposite. Global trade isn't a vacuum, it's a multiplayer game with highly vindictive participants. When the US raised tariffs, its trading partners didn't just shrug and say, "Well played, America." They retaliated. Canada, Europe, and others immediately slapped their own punitive tariffs on American exports. According to economic data, countries that retaliated reduced their imports from the US by an average of 30%. Within just 4 years, global trade had plummeted by a staggering 65%. Smoot-Hawley didn't save the American economy. It took a bad recession, poured gasoline on it, and locked the doors. But the consequences were much darker than just corporate bankruptcies. When global trade collapses, economies isolate. When economies isolate, poverty skyrockets. And when poverty skyrockets, political extremism thrives. There is a very direct, mathematically verifiable line from the protectionist trade wars of the 1930s to the rise of fascism and the outbreak of World War II. When goods don't cross borders, armies usually do. Fast forward to 1947. World War II is over, Europe is a smouldering pile of rubble, and global leaders are profoundly traumatized. A group of diplomats and economists looked at the devastation and realized that if they wanted to stop a Third World War, they couldn't just rely on fragile peace treaties. They had to financially entangle nations so deeply that going to war would mean mutual economic suicide. Their solution was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, which officially leveled up into the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 1995. Now, I promise to explain mechanics, not hype. So how do you actually force sovereign countries, many of which historically hate each other, to trade fairly? You don't ask them to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. You invent a bureaucratic mechanic so rigid that it removes the human element entirely. This mechanic is the beating heart of the WTO. It is called the Most Favored Nation (MFN) principle. The name Most Favored Nation is actually a masterpiece of terrible branding. It sounds like you get to pick one country to be your absolute best friend and give them VIP treatment. In reality, it means the exact opposite. Under WTO rules, Most favored nation means everyone gets the VIP treatment. Let's say you're the United States, and you decide to be nice to the United Kingdom by lowering your import tariff on British steel from 10% to 5%. Under the MFN rule, the second you give that 5% rate to the UK, you legally must give that exact same 5% rate to every single other member of the WTO. You cannot discriminate. If you lower the barrier for one, you lower it for all 166 members. There are a few highly specific exceptions for formal, comprehensive free trade agreements, but the baseline rule is absolute non-discrimination. Why is this mechanic so genius? Because it actively prevents the chaotic retaliatory tariff spirals of the 1930s. If everyone gets the same deal, nobody can play favourites, and the geopolitical temperature stays low. The strongest criticism of the most favoured nation rule is that it inherently creates free riders. Critics argue, why should the US or Europe lower their tariffs and automatically grant open market access to a country that might be secretly subsidising its own industries, using forced labour or stealing intellectual property? Aren't we just handing over our economic leverage for free? It's a highly valid concern, and it's the exact reason you see politicians today screaming about fair trade instead of free trade. But let's look at the historical math before we throw the system out. In 1947, before this system took hold, average global tariffs among major economies hovered around 22%, a figure meticulously verified by economic historians, debunking the often lazily cited 40% myth. Today, thanks to the relentless, grinding application of the MFN principle through successive WTO negotiation rounds, average applied tariffs globally have dropped to under 5%. By forcing everyone to play by the MFN rule, the GATT and the WTO orchestrated the greatest explosion of wealth in human history. It allowed supply chains to fragment efficiently. It's the reason your smartphone can feature glass from Japan, a processor designed in California, microchips manufactured in Taiwan, and assembly done in Vietnam, all resulting in a device you can actually afford. If every border crossing involved a discriminatory, politically motivated 25% tariff, your phone wouldn't cost $1,000, it would cost $10,000. The WTO basically turned global trade from a deadly unpredictable knife fight in an alleyway into a highly regulated, incredibly boring, passive-aggressive spreadsheet. And for about 70 years it worked beautifully. But here is the dark irony of the WTO. The very mechanic that made it so successful, its rigid bureaucratic insistence on treating everyone exactly the same, is exactly what is tearing it apart today. Because what happens when a massive, state-sponsored economy figures out how to exploit the spreadsheet without technically breaking the rules? Well, that brings us to the WTO's biggest headache, and the reason the system is currently experiencing a full-blown existential crisis. 2. The China shock and the greatest legal loophole in economic history. The year is 2000. You're sitting in a plush, well-air-conditioned ballroom in Washington, D.C., sipping lukewarm coffee. Up at the podium, President Bill Clinton is pitching the American business elite on what he calls a win-win scenario, granting China permanent normal trade relations and letting them into the World Trade Organization. With absolute confidence, Clinton declares that bringing China into the WTO will draw China into a system of international rules and thereby encourage the Chinese to choose reform at home and integration with the world. He promises that the invisible hand of the free market will inevitably democratize the Chinese Communist Party. Narrator: it did not, in fact, democratize the Chinese Communist Party. On December 11th, 2001, China officially became a member of the WTO. It was the economic equivalent of letting a brilliant, fiercely competitive heavyweight boxer into a chess tournament, only to realize the rulebook doesn't explicitly forbid punching your opponent in the face. To understand why this broke the WTO, we have to look at the actual mechanics of the rules, specifically a piece of WTO legislation called the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, the SCM agreement. Remember how the WTO is essentially a massive, passive-aggressive spreadsheet designed to keep trade fair? A huge part of that fairness relies on banning unfair government subsidies. If you are a US solar panel manufacturer, you have to raise private capital, pay market rates for electricity, and buy materials at market prices. If the US government suddenly hands you $1 billion in free cash so you can sell your panels at half price and bankrupt your European competitors, the WTO will immediately flag that as an illegal direct subsidy. You will be penalised. The system works. But the WTO was written by free market capitalists. It was built entirely on the assumption that governments and corporations are fundamentally separate entities. China's economy, however, is a system of state capitalism, and they looked at the WTO rulebook and found the ultimate loophole: state-owned enterprises, SOS. Here is how the exploit works in practice. Let's say a private Chinese manufacturing firm wants to dominate the global market. The Chinese government doesn't just hand them a legally problematic bag of cash. Instead, a state-owned bank gives them a massive loan at a 0% interest rate that they never really have to pay back. Then, a state-owned energy company provides them with electricity at a fraction of the cost of production. Then, a local municipality gives them the land to build their factory on. When Western countries run to the WTO in Geneva to complain about these subsidies, the WTO lawyers pull out their magnifying glasses, look at the SCM agreement, and freeze. Why? Because the WTO's legal definition of a public body is incredibly narrow. Historically, it has been exceedingly difficult to legally prove that a nominally independent state-owned bank or a provincial energy company acting on implicit state directives constitutes a direct government body illegally subsidizing an industry. China didn't necessarily break the rules. They just ruthlessly exploited the fact that the rules weren't written for a system where the state is the market. Let the numbers provide the shock value here. Between 2001 and 2011, this state-sponsored turbo-capitalism completely rewired the planet. According to the landmark economic study by MIT's David Autor on what became known as the China shock, the influx of cheap state-backed Chinese exports wiped out approximately 2.4 million manufacturing jobs in the United States alone. Entire industrial ecosystems in the American Midwest and Western Europe were hollowed out, leaving behind shuttered factories and massive economic resentment. But here is where we must apply the anti-propaganda rule and embrace nuance. We cannot simply write off China's rise as nothing but a product of cheating the system. That is a comforting lie Western politicians tell themselves to avoid accountability. China genuinely executed the greatest mobilization of human labor and infrastructure development in the history of the world. They built unparalleled megaports, bullet trains, and hyper-efficient supply chains. They produced millions of highly skilled engineers. They played the globalization game faster, harder, and smarter than anyone else. Furthermore, their integration into the WTO lifted nearly 800 million Chinese citizens out of extreme poverty, a verifiable humanitarian miracle. Simultaneously, Western consumers absolutely benefited from this dynamic. The reason you can buy a 65-inch 4K flat-screen TV at Walmart for $299 is directly tied to the very same Chinese manufacturing dominance that hollowed out the Ohio Rust Belt. We traded domestic manufacturing jobs for hyper-cheap consumer goods and zero-inflation electronics. It was a trade-off the West willingly made, until the political backlash became too loud to ignore. By the mid-2000s, the illusion was shattering. The West realized that the WTO's spreadsheet couldn't compute state capitalism, and the system was completely failing to discipline Beijing's heavily subsidized industrial policies. So what happens when the referee can no longer enforce the rules? The biggest players on the field decide to simply take the referee out back and shoot him. Which brings us to the moment the United States decided to intentionally sabotage the Supreme Court of World Trade. 3. The Supreme Court of Trade and how America unplugged its life support. Imagine you are playing a high-stakes multi-million-dollar game of basketball. The opposing team constantly fouls you, so you complain to the referee. The referee reviews the play, agrees with you, and awards you free throws. But right before you take your shot, the opposing coach shouts, "I appeal this decision to the Supreme Referee." There's just one problem. The Supreme Referee retired 3 years ago, his office is locked, and the league refuses to hire a replacement. But because the rules explicitly state that no penalties can be enforced while an appeal is pending, the game is permanently paused. You never get your free throws. The opposing team keeps aggressively fouling you without consequence. Welcome to the current, incredibly broken reality of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, or, as international trade lawyers colloquially refer to it, appealing into the void. To understand how we arrived at this level of bureaucratic absurdity, we need to look at what was once widely considered the crown jewel of the World Trade Organization. When the WTO was established in 1995, its creators knew that a rulebook is entirely useless without an enforcer. So, they built a two-tier justice system. Stage 1 is the dispute panel. If country A believes country B is illegally subsidizing steel, they file a complaint. A panel of ad hoc trade experts is assembled, they review the evidence, and they issue a ruling. But what if the panel makes a mistake? Enter Stage 2, the appellate body. The appellate body was essentially the Supreme Court of World Trade. It consisted of 7 permanent, highly prestigious judges serving 4-year terms. If you lost at the panel stage, you could appeal to the appellate body. To hear an appeal, a minimum quorum of 3 judges was required. Their word was final, binding, and backed by the threat of legally authorized economic retaliation. For over 2 decades, it was one of the most active and effective international courts in human history, processing hundreds of complex state-to-state disputes. Then the United States decided to execute a slow-motion, entirely legal assassination of the court. Here is how the mechanics of the blockade actually worked. Under WTO rules, appointing a new judge to the appellate body requires a consensus of all member nations. This means any single country holds an absolute veto over new hires. Starting in 2016, under the Obama administration, the US began vetoing the reappointment of specific judges they felt were ruling unfairly against American interests. In 2017, the Trump administration escalated this from a targeted strike to a blanket siege, blocking all new appointments to the appellate body as the current judges' terms naturally expired. And for the record, the Biden administration has maintained this exact same blockade, proving this isn't a partisan issue, it is a foundational shift in American geopolitical strategy. By December 11th, 2019, the math finally caught up with the system. The terms of 2 of the last 3 remaining judges expired. The appellate body was left with exactly 1 judge. Since a minimum of 3 is required to hear a case, the highest court in global economics instantly lost its quorum. The lights went out. The gavel was frozen. Before we just label the United States as the villain here, we must apply the nuance rule because their complaints were not entirely baseless. In fact, many of them are deeply rooted in factual legal reality. The US Trade Representative, USTR, argued that over the years, the appellate body engaged in rampant judicial overreach. The WTO rulebook was written with a lot of constructive ambiguity, intentionally vague language designed to help diplomats reach compromises in the 1990s. The US argued that instead of simply interpreting the rules as written, the appellate body judges took it upon themselves to fill in the blanks, effectively creating new international laws that sovereign nations never actually agreed to. Furthermore, the appellate body was starting to treat its past rulings as binding precedent, like the US Supreme Court does. But the WTO rulebook specifically forbids this. Each case is supposed to be judged strictly on its own merits. Most critically for Washington, the appellate body repeatedly ruled against US anti-dumping measures, the exact defensive tools America was trying to use to protect its domestic industries from the deluge of cheap, state-subsidized Chinese goods we discussed in the last section. From the American perspective, unelected bureaucrats in Geneva were stripping away US sovereignty and disarming their economic defenses. So the US didn't break the rules. They just ruthlessly weaponized the consensus mechanic to starve the beast. Quick pause. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the brutal mechanics of global economics, hit the subscribe button. It helps the channel decode more of these massive invisible systems running our world. Also, let me know in the comments which global institution you want me to ruthlessly dissect next. The IMF, the World Bank. Let me know. The fallout of this paralysis is where the data gets truly shocking, because the WTO rules explicitly state that a panel report cannot become legally binding if it has been appealed. The system has developed a fatal loophole. Today, if a country blatantly breaks a trade rule and loses at the Stage 1 panel, they don't change their behaviour. They simply file an appeal. The appeal gets sent to the empty locked office of the appellate body. The case enters a permanent state of suspended animation. As of late 2025, Current WTO data indicates that dozens of dispute panel rulings have been appealed into the void, effectively nullifying the legal force of the entire organisation. The referee has a whistle, but no lungs to blow it. While a group of nations led by the European Union has tried to create a temporary voluntary workaround called the Multi-Party Interim Appeal Arbitration Arrangement, MPIA, participation is limited. Crucially, the United States, India, and several other major economic powers absolutely refuse to join it. It is a band-aid on a decapitation. Without a functioning Supreme Court to peacefully and legally resolve trillion-dollar trade disputes, the global economy is slowly reverting to the might makes right dynamic of the pre-1940s. Current trends suggest that we are moving away from a single, unified global spreadsheet and towards a fractured world of regional blocs, heavy tariffs, and retaliatory trade wars. But the paralysis of the appellate body is only half the story. To truly understand why the WTO is struggling to govern the modern world, we have to look at the actual stuff we are trading. The WTO was built perfectly to regulate the shipment of cars, bananas, and steel. But what happens when the most valuable commodity on Earth isn't a physical object at all, but a line of code travelling at the speed of light? 4. Governing the matrix, trying to regulate 2026 with a 1998 rulebook. Let's try another scenario. You're a customs officer standing at a seaport in 1994. Your job is incredibly straightforward. A massive steel shipping container gets pulled off a freighter. You open it up. It is full of 10,000 compact discs. You look up the official World Trade Organization tariff schedule for physical audio media. You slap a 5% import tax on the crate, collect the money for your government, and send the truck on its way. Simple, tangible, the system works. Now, fast forward to today. You're still a customs officer, but you aren't at a seaport. You're staring at a fibre optic cable running along the bottom of the ocean. In the span of 1 second, an American teenager streams a K-pop song from a server in Seoul. A German architectural firm downloads a complex 3D rendering generated by a freelance designer in Brazil, and an AI startup in Kenya accesses processing power from an Amazon Web Services data center in Virginia. Where exactly did the trade happen? Whose border was crossed? Is a downloaded software update a good or a service? And most importantly, how do you put a toll booth on a terabyte of data? Welcome to the WTO's digital nightmare. To understand why the WTO is currently having a collective aneurysm over digital trade, we have to look at when its foundational rulebooks were written. The two main pillars of the WTO are the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which handles physical goods, and the GATS, General Agreement on Trade and Services, which handles stuff like banking and tourism. Both of these massive legal frameworks were finalised in 1994. Think about the internet in 1994. Mark Zuckerberg was 10 years old. E-commerce consisted of a few nerds on dial-up modems slowly downloading pixelated JPEGs. The diplomats who wrote the WTO rules didn't even try to categorise digital trade because, economically speaking, it didn't exist, yet. By 1998, as the dot-com boom began, WTO members realised they had a massive legal grey area on their hands. Instead of rewriting the rulebook, they decided to kick the can down the road. They agreed to something called the Moratorium on Customs Duties on Electronic Transmissions. They essentially passed a temporary rule that said, nobody's allowed to put tariffs on internet data until we figure out exactly what the internet is. It is now nearly 30 years later. We have artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and a global digital economy currently valued well north of $4 trillion annually. Digital services now make up more than 54% of all global services exports. And guess what? The WTO still hasn't figured it out. Instead of writing permanent rules, the 166 member nations just keep nervously renewing that 1998 temporary moratorium every 2 years, like a panicked college student continually asking their professor for an extension on a term paper that was due a decade ago. It is an institution built for 20th century cargo ships attempting to govern 21st century code. But here is where the global spreadsheet starts to fracture. What happens if the moratorium isn't renewed? What if a country decides they want to start taxing data? Let's check the argument of the countries trying to kill the moratorium. A coalition heavily championed by developing economies like India, South Africa, and Indonesia. Their argument is fundamentally about sovereignty and what they call digital colonialism. Historically, developing nations relied heavily on import tariffs to fund their governments and build physical infrastructure. When people bought physical books, DVDs, or software CD-ROMs, those goods crossed a physical border and the government took a cut. Today, all of that consumption has been digitized. Netflix, Spotify, and Microsoft beam their products directly into the country via the cloud. According to a heavily cited and hotly debated report by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, developing nations are potentially losing up to $10 billion a year in tariff revenue because of the WTO moratorium. From the perspective of the Global South, big tech companies in Silicon Valley and Beijing are extracting billions of dollars from their citizens while paying zero import taxes to help maintain the local roads, grids, and schools. So, they argue, it is entirely fair to drop the moratorium and start taxing electronic transmissions. It's a compelling, emotionally resonant argument. But when you look at the brutal mechanics of actually implementing a data tariff, the logic completely falls apart. Let the facts dismantle the hype. How do you technically enforce a tariff on a data packet? You can't. The only way a government could possibly track, value, and tax digital transmissions would be to force local internet service providers, ISPs, to act as digital customs agents. They would have to deeply inspect every single byte of data crossing into the country, determine its origin, assess its commercial value, and hold the data hostage until a tax is paid. This isn't just a dystopian privacy nightmare, it would effectively break the internet. It would require building massive state-controlled firewalls that would throttle bandwidth to a crawl. Furthermore, economic studies from organisations like the OECD prove that the financial math of dropping the moratorium is completely self-destructive. Yes, India might recover a few $1 billion in lost tariff revenue, but to do so, they would have to tax the very data their own domestic industries rely on. If an Indian tech startup suddenly has to pay a 20% import tariff every time they access an overseas cloud server, utilise a foreign API, or download an open-source library from GitHub, that local startup instantly becomes globally uncompetitive. The data indicates that the economic damage inflicted on domestic businesses through higher digital costs would absolutely dwarf the paltry tariff revenue the government collects. It's the economic equivalent of burning down your own house because you're mad you can't tax the sunlight hitting the roof. Currently, a splinter group of about 90 WTO members, the Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce, is desperately trying to write a new modern rulebook to permanently protect digital trade. But remember the core mechanic of the WTO. It operates on absolute consensus. Every single one of the 166 members holds a veto. A tiny handful of holdout nations can stall the entire digital future of the planet to maintain geopolitical leverage. But if you think regulating invisible data is chaotic, just wait. Because while countries will argue politely in Geneva over cloud computing, there is one physical commodity that instantly causes governments to throw the entire WTO rulebook into the nearest shredder. Let's talk about what happens when the world gets hungry. 5. The hypocrisy of hunger, or why Texas cotton dominates the free market. Let's run another scenario. You're a cotton farmer in the West African nation of Burkina Faso. You wake up before dawn, you work the soil largely by hand, you rely entirely on natural rainfall, and your overhead costs are practically non-existent. From a purely economic standpoint, you are one of the most cost-efficient, leanest producers of cotton on planet Earth. Now, imagine a cotton farmer in Texas. He operates a fleet of GPS-guided, air-conditioned combine harvesters that cost $500,000 each. He relies on massive, energy-intensive irrigation systems to grow a water-heavy crop in a semi-arid desert. His overhead is astronomical. According to the sacred laws of the free market, the exact laws the World Trade Organization was built to protect, the farmer in Burkina Faso should absolutely wipe the floor with the Texas farmer on price. The African farmer should dominate the global supply chain, get rich, and use that wealth to build a local infrastructure. But he doesn't. He can barely survive. Why? Because the Texas farmer has a silent multi-billion-dollar business partner called the United States federal government. Welcome to the Agreement on Agriculture, AOA, which is arguably the most hypocritical, intensely rigged piece of legislation in the entire history of international trade. When the WTO was established in 1995, wealthy nations, specifically the United States and the European Union, stood at the podium in Geneva and loudly preached the gospel of free trade to the developing world. They demanded that poorer nations open their borders, lower their tariffs, and stop protecting their local industries. Let the free market decide, they cheered. But there was a catch. When it came to their own farmers, the rich countries quietly built a legal fortress. To understand how they did this, we need to look at the mechanics of the WTO's traffic light subsidy system. During the 1990s negotiations, the WTO categorized agricultural subsidies into different boxes. The amber box. These are subsidies that directly distort trade, like a government paying a farmer a guaranteed high price for every ton of wheat they produce. The WTO said, these are bad, you must reduce them. The blue box. These are subsidies tied to programs that intentionally limit production, paying farmers not to grow crops to keep prices stable. The WTO said, these are okay for now. The green box. These are subsidies that supposedly don't distort trade. Things like funding for agricultural research, pest control, or, crucially, direct income support that isn't officially tied to current crop production. The WTO said, these are great, spend as much as you want. Do you see the loophole yet? The United States and the EU didn't actually stop subsidizing their farmers. They just hired brilliant lawyers to recategorize their massive payouts. They moved their billions out of the illegal amber box and stuffed them directly into the perfectly legal green box. They shifted from saying, here is $100 for growing this much corn, to saying, here is a $100 direct income support check based on historical data. By the way, keep growing corn. Let the numbers provide the shock value. According to data from the OECD, wealthy nations pump over $800 billion a year into supporting their agricultural sectors. The US government alone hands tens of billions of dollars annually to its agricultural producers through complex farm bill programs, crop insurance subsidies, and disaster relief. Because of this massive injection of government cash, American and European farmers can afford to dump millions of tons of subsidized crops onto the global market at prices drastically below the actual cost of production. This artificially depresses global commodity prices, so our hyper-efficient farmer in Burkina Faso, along with the rest of the cotton 4 nations, Benin, Chad and Mali, loses hundreds of millions of dollars in potential export revenue every single year. They're competing against the US Treasury, and the WTO rulebook essentially says, well, technically the US is using green box money, so it's perfectly legal. Tough luck. Are the US and the EU just cartoon villains twirling their mustaches while starving the developing world? No. They are executing the most basic primal directive of a sovereign state, survival. The strongest argument for extreme agricultural protectionism is that food security is national security. You can outsource your t-shirt manufacturing to Bangladesh. You can outsource your toy production to Vietnam. If those supply chains break, people complain, but they don't die. If you outsource your food supply to the whims of the global free market, you are putting a loaded gun to the head of your own population. As we saw during the supply chain breakdowns of the COVID-19 pandemic, or when the war in Ukraine suddenly trapped millions of tons of grain in the Black Sea, global supply chains are incredibly fragile. If a nation cannot feed itself during a geopolitical crisis, it collapses. Period. Therefore, wealthy nations will bend, break and rewrite any WTO rule necessary to ensure that their domestic agricultural infrastructure never dies, even if it means operating at a massive artificial financial loss. And frankly, the developing world has finally caught on to the game, which brings us to the current standoff that has completely frozen the WTO, India's public stockholding. India has roughly 1.4 billion mouths to feed. To prevent famine and support hundreds of millions of impoverished farmers, the Indian government runs a massive operation where it buys wheat and rice directly from its farmers at a guaranteed minimum support price, MSP, stockpiles it, and distributes it to the poor. Under the strict 1995 WTO rules, India's actions are technically a massive illegal amber box subsidy. Why? Because the WTO calculates the legal limit for subsidies based on global commodity prices from, and I am not joking, the years 1986 to 1988. The WTO is literally trying to tell India that it is illegally subsidizing its farmers today because they are paying them more than the market rate from 40 years ago, completely ignoring 4 decades of inflation. In 2013, at a WTO ministerial conference in Bali, India essentially held the entire organization hostage. They looked at the US and Europe and said, "You guys have been exploiting the green box loophole for decades. We are trying to prevent mass starvation. If you sue us over our food stockpiles, we will veto every single other piece of legislation in this building." Panicked, the WTO members agreed to a peace clause, a temporary truce stating that no one would sue India over its food subsidies until a permanent solution was found. That was over a decade ago. A permanent solution has still not been found. Today, the agricultural negotiations at the WTO are a smouldering crater. Developing nations, led by India, flatly refuse to agree to new rules on digital trade or environmental goods until the rich countries fix the deeply rigged agricultural system. The rich countries refuse to dismantle their food security apparatus. It is a perfect multilateral Mexican standoff. Quick check. If you were the supreme referee of the WTO, how would you fix the food trade issue? Do you prioritize a truly free market, or does a country have an absolute right to subsidize its own food supply? Let me know in the comments. I actually read them, and it helps me figure out what economic paradoxes to cover next. But the hypocrisy of food trade is just the appetizer, because right now there is a new, much larger threat tearing through the halls of the WTO. It's a crisis where the rules of free trade are violently colliding with the literal survival of the human species. Let's talk about the weaponization of the environment. 6. The weaponization of the environment, green protectionism versus a burning planet. Let's imagine a new scenario. It is January 2nd, 2026. You are the CEO of a massive steel manufacturing plant in India. For a decade, your most lucrative client has been an automotive parts manufacturer in Germany. You produce high-quality, perfectly identical steel to your German competitors, but because your labour and energy costs are lower, your steel is 15% cheaper. It is a textbook example of globalised comparative advantage. The system works, until your phone rings. It's your German buyer, and he is furious. He informs you that overnight, your steel just became radically more expensive to import. Did the quality of your steel drop? No. Did you raise your prices? No. Did the German government slap a traditional illegal tariff on your product? Technically no. Instead, the European Union has looked at your smokestacks, looked at the coal-fired power grid your factory relies on, and decided that your steel is fundamentally dirty. Welcome to the definitive phase of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, which officially went fully live and began enforcing financial penalties on January 1st, 2026. This is the frontier where the rigid, decades-old rules of global free trade are violently colliding with the existential reality of climate change, and the resulting wreckage is currently tearing the World Trade Organization apart. To understand how the CBAM works, we have to look at the mechanics of carbon leakage. For years, the European Union has been aggressive about taxing its own domestic industries for emitting greenhouse gases through a cap-and-trade program called the EU Emissions Trading System, ETS. But this created a massive unintended loophole. If it costs a German steelmaker millions of euros in carbon taxes to produce steel in Europe, but it costs an Indian or Turkish steelmaker €0 in carbon taxes to produce it at home, the German company goes bankrupt. Even worse for the environment, the actual carbon emissions don't drop. The pollution just leaks across the border to countries with weaker environmental laws. The EU's solution, the CBAM. It is essentially a toll booth for carbon. As of early 2026, if you want to import carbon-intensive goods like steel, cement, aluminum, or fertilizer into the European Union, you, the importer, must calculate exactly how much carbon was emitted during the manufacturing of those goods overseas, and you must purchase CBAM certificates to offset the difference. The EU is essentially forcing the entire world to pay European carbon taxes if they want access to the European market. From an environmental standpoint, this is a brilliant, ruthlessly effective mechanic, but from a WTO legal standpoint, It is a radioactive minefield. Remember our golden rule of the WTO non-discrimination. Under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, a roll of steel is a roll of steel. Historically, the WTO has strictly forbidden countries from discriminating against a physical product based solely on its process and production methods, PPMs. If the final physical product is identical, you cannot legally tax it differently just because you don't like how the foreign factory operates. But the EU lawyers found a backdoor. Article 20. This is the WTO's General Exceptions Clause, which allows countries to break trade rules if it is strictly necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life, or health. The EU argues that climate change is an existential threat. Therefore, taxing dirty foreign steel is a legally justified environmental necessity. Are countries like India, China, and Brazil just anti-environment villains for opposing this? Absolutely not. To them, the CBAM is nothing but thinly veiled green protectionism. They argue that wealthy Western nations spent 150 years burning cheap, filthy coal to industrialize their economies and get incredibly rich. Now that the West has the capital to transition to expensive green tech, they are suddenly slamming the door on developing nations trying to follow the exact same path to prosperity. By forcing an Indian steel mill to pay European carbon prices, the EU isn't just saving the planet, they are conveniently pricing their cheapest global competitors entirely out of the market. And if you think the EU's carbon toll booth is causing chaos, look at what the United States just did. The US government realized that a massive carbon tax would be political suicide domestically, so they took the opposite approach to the environment. Instead of taxing foreign pollution, they decided to throw a historic mountain of taxpayer cash at domestic clean energy. Through the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, the US government rolled out hundreds of billions of dollars in tax credits and subsidies for electric vehicles, solar panels, and wind turbines. But there was a massive catch. To get the best subsidies, the companies had to manufacture the goods in the United States or use American-made components. If you remember our breakdown of the WTO traffic light subsidy system, tying financial handouts strictly to the use of domestic goods over foreign goods is a glaring, unapologetic red light illegal subsidy. It violates the core WTO principle of national treatment, and the rest of the world immediately called them out on it. China dragged the United States to the WTO Dispute Settlement Court, and the data here is incredibly fresh. On January 30th, 2026, the WTO panel officially released its 74-page ruling. The verdict? A brutal defeat for the US. The WTO explicitly ruled that the core domestic content tax credits of the Inflation Reduction Act violate global trade laws because they illegally discriminate against foreign imports. Furthermore, the WTO flatly rejected America's defense that these subsidies were necessary to protect public morals against Chinese market dominance. So, how did the United States respond to being internationally condemned by the referee of global trade? They shrugged. The US Trade Representative, USTR, issued a scathing statement on the very same day, effectively rejecting the WTO's findings entirely. The US argued that the WTO is fundamentally incapable of dealing with China's massive state-subsidized excess capacity, and declared that America will always take necessary measures to support US jobs. And because the United States intentionally paralyzed the WTO's appellate body Supreme Court back in 2019, as we covered in Section 3, the US can simply appeal this January 2026 ruling into the void. The WTO has formally declared the American environmental strategy illegal, and the American government has essentially replied, "Make us stop." This is the terrifying reality of the WTO today. The two largest economic blocs on Earth, the EU and the US, are now actively circumventing or blatantly violating the established rules of global free trade in the name of saving the environment and reindustrializing. The spreadsheet is tearing. But while politicians fight over carbon credits and wind turbines, there is an entirely different war being waged under the radar. It isn't a war over things we grow or things we build. It's a war over the fundamental building blocks of human health and intellectual property. And it involves a piece of WTO legislation that literally determines who gets access to life-saving medicine and who is legally required to die waiting for it. 7. The price of a life, the brutal math of intellectual property. Let's travel back to the late 1990s. You're a doctor working in a crowded, underfunded clinic in Pretoria, South Africa. An entirely new, terrifying plague is tearing through your community. HIV/AIDS. Here is the agonizing reality of your situation. A cocktail of antiretroviral ARV drugs exists that can completely save your patients' lives. The medication is a verified scientific miracle. But the Western pharmaceutical companies that hold the patents are charging roughly $10,000 per patient per year. The average annual income in your country is a fraction of that. Meanwhile, a manufacturer in India has reverse-engineered the exact same drugs and is offering to sell you generic versions for about $300 a year. For $300, you can save a life. You go to buy the Indian generics, but a team of highly paid international trade lawyers immediately blocks you. They inform you that buying the affordable, life-saving medicine is a direct violation of international law, and if your government allows it, they will be slammed with catastrophic trade sanctions. Welcome to the TRIPS Agreement, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. It is the most emotionally devastating, fiercely debated legal framework within the entire World Trade Organization. To understand how the WTO became the global bouncer for pharmaceutical monopolies, we have to look at how global trade evolved in the late 20th century. By the 1980s, the United States and Europe realized that their greatest exports were no longer just cars and wheat. They were exporting ideas, software, movies, and most importantly, highly advanced pharmaceuticals. But ideas are notoriously easy to steal. If you spend $1 billion inventing a new drug, and a foreign lab simply copies the chemical formula the day it hits the market, you go bankrupt. So, during the creation of the WTO in 1995, wealthy nations forced the TRIPS agreement into the foundational rulebook. The mechanic of TRIPS is simple and ruthless. If you want to be a member of the WTO and sell your goods on the global market, you must guarantee foreign inventors a strict baseline 20-year monopoly on their patents. No unauthorized copying. Period. But let's pause. Let's see the argument for Big Pharma. Are these companies simply comic book villains hoarding life-saving cures to watch the developing world burn? No. They are operating exactly as the system demands, driven by the brutal mathematics of scientific innovation. According to data from the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, bringing a single new prescription drug to market costs an average of $2.5 billion, and that factors in the massive rate of failure. For every one compound that makes it to a pharmacy shelf, thousands of others fail in clinical trials, burning billions of dollars of research capital in the process. The strongest argument for TRIPS is that without the guarantee of a 20-year global monopoly, to recoup those massive high-risk investments, private capital would completely abandon medical research. The data strongly indicates that if you destroy intellectual property rights, you might make today's drugs cheaper, but you effectively kill the funding for the cure for Alzheimer's or the next global pandemic tomorrow. The monopoly is the grim, necessary engine of human medical advancement. But back in South Africa in the late 90s, that economic logic provided zero comfort to a dying population. In a move that remains one of the greatest public relations disasters in corporate history, a coalition of 39 major pharmaceutical companies actually sued Nelson Mandela's government to prevent them from passing a law that would allow the importation of cheap generic ARV drugs. The optical shock value of this was catastrophic. The world watched as the rigidly enforced rules of global trade actively obstructed the survival of millions. The WTO, an organization built to increase global prosperity, was suddenly viewed as a bureaucratic death panel. Under massive global outrage, the pharmaceutical companies dropped the lawsuit in 2001. That same year, the WTO panicked and held a ministerial conference in Qatar to frantically patch the legal loophole. They issued what is known as the Doha Declaration. The Doha Declaration clarified a crucial pre-existing mechanic in the TRIPS agreement called compulsory licensing. Here is how the loophole works. If a country is facing an extreme national health emergency, like an HIV epidemic, the government can legally declare, "We acknowledge your patent, but people are dying. We are unilaterally granting a local factory the license to manufacture a cheap generic version of your drug immediately. We will pay you a small government-mandated royalty. but your monopoly in our country is temporarily suspended. It was a brilliant compromise. It maintained the global patent system while creating an emergency escape hatch for sovereign nations facing mass casualties. The system worked. Fast forward to 2020, a novel coronavirus shuts down the entire planet. The global economy enters freefall. Scientists perform a modern miracle and develop highly effective mRNA vaccines in less than a year. And immediately the exact same war broke out. India and South Africa marched right back into the WTO in Geneva and demanded a blanket temporary waiver on all TRIPS IP protections for COVID-19 vaccines, tests and treatments. They argued that the Doha Declaration's compulsory licensing mechanic was too slow, too bureaucratic, and required negotiating country by country, drug by drug. They demanded the WTO temporarily suspend the patent rules globally to allow anyone, anywhere, to manufacture the vaccines. The European Union and the United Kingdom, home to major vaccine developers, fiercely blocked the proposal. They argued, backed by significant industry data, that the bottleneck wasn't intellectual property. It was a severe lack of global manufacturing capacity, raw materials, and cold chain logistics. They argued that stripping IP rights wouldn't magically build high-tech mRNA factories in the developing world, but it would permanently damage the incentive structure that just saved the planet. For nearly 2 years, as the virus mutated, the WTO members argued in circles. By the time they finally agreed to a heavily watered-down, incredibly limited compromise on vaccine patents in mid-2022, the worst of the pandemic had already passed, and global vaccine supplies were actually in surplus. The WTO was too slow, too divided, and too paralyzed by its own consensus rules to act decisively during a real-time global meltdown. Quick pause. This is the ultimate ethical dilemma in economics. Does a pharmaceutical company have the absolute right to protect its trillion-dollar IP, or should all medical patents be suspended during a global emergency? Let me know down in the comments where you draw the line between profit and human survival. The failure of the WTO to swiftly manage the COVID-19 EP crisis, combined with the paralysis of its Supreme Court, the chaos of digital data laws, and the weaponization of green tariffs, has led global leaders to a terrifying conclusion. The World Trade Organization might simply be beyond saving. So, what are the world's superpowers doing about it? They are actively building a replacement, and it is going to fundamentally change the price of every single thing you buy. 8. The era of friendshoring, or how to build a $100,000 iPhone. Let's play out our final scenario. You are standing in an electronics store in late 2026, looking at the newest flagship smartphone or a sleek electric vehicle. You check the price tag, and you physically wince. The cost has spiked by 30% compared to just a few years ago. Did the technology undergo a massive leap? No. Did the raw materials suddenly vanish? No. You are paying a massive premium because the invisible, $33 trillion global spreadsheet we talked about in the very beginning has been officially ripped to shreds. The components in that phone no longer come from the cheapest, most efficient factories on Earth. They come from the friendliest ones. Welcome to the era of friendshoring, de-risking, and the weaponization of the supply chain. This is what happens when the World Trade Organization loses its authority. The world's superpowers retreat into heavily armed economic bunkers. To understand how countries are legally bypassing the paralyzed WTO, we have to look at the ultimate escape hatch hidden deep within the original 1947 rulebook, Article 24 of the GATT. If you remember from Section 1, the golden rule of the WTO is the most favored nation MFN principle. If you lower a tariff for one country, you legally must lower it for all 166 members. But Article 24 is the massive loophole. It essentially states that a group of countries can completely ignore the MFN rule, provided they form a comprehensive free trade area or a customs union among themselves. Historically, economists viewed Article 24 as a stepping stone. The logic was that if a few countries formed a free trade club, like the European Union or NAFTA, it would eventually encourage broader global integration. It was supposed to be a warm-up act for the main event of a totally borderless global market. Instead, it became the primary weapon of economic balkanization. Current WTO data indicates that There are currently over 360 active regional trade agreements, RTAs, in force around the world. As the WTO's central authority decayed, paralyzed by the appellate body crisis, the agriculture standoff, and the failure to regulate digital trade, nations simply stopped trying to negotiate global deals. They started forming exclusive, hyper-competitive economic gang territories. You have the USMCA, the rebranded NAFTA, tying North America together. You have the CPTPP locking down the Pacific Rim, which the US famously abandoned, and China is actively trying to join. And you have the massive RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a sprawling China-led bloc encompassing nearly a third of the global population. The global economy is no longer a single, unified free market. It is a Venn diagram of competing, deeply paranoid regional blocs. Are politicians just destroying global free trade out of pure nationalism and spite? No. They are responding to the terrifying realization that optimizing solely for economic efficiency is a great way to commit national suicide. For 30 years, the WTO optimized global trade for one thing: getting the absolute lowest price for the consumer using just-in-time manufacturing. If it was 3% cheaper to make a microchip in Taiwan, ship it to Shenzhen for assembly, and fly it to Los Angeles, that is exactly what the market did. It eliminated warehouse costs. It ran incredibly lean. But a lean system has zero shock absorbers. When a global pandemic hit, or when a massive container ship got wedged sideways in the Suez Canal, or when geopolitical wars erupted in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, the West looked at their hyper-efficient supply chains and realized they were uniquely vulnerable. If a single factory complex in Asia shut down, massive automakers in Detroit literally could not finish building their trucks because they were missing a $2 semiconductor. If a geopolitical rival decided to restrict the export of critical minerals like gallium or germanium, entire Western defense and green energy sectors could be paralyzed overnight. So the new objective is no longer efficiency. The new objective is resilience. This is the mechanical core of friendshoring. The United States, Europe, and Japan are currently spending hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars to physically rip their supply chains out of hostile or unpredictable territories and rebuild them either at home, onshoring, or in allied nations, friendshoring. Look at the Chips and Science Act in the United States. The US government is injecting over $52 billion to subsidize the construction of massive semiconductor fabrication plants, fabs, in places like Arizona and Ohio. They are paying companies like TSMC and Intel to bring the most complex manufacturing process in human history onto American soil. But let the numbers provide the brutal reality check. You cannot simply clone a 30-year-old Taiwanese manufacturing ecosystem in the American desert without severe financial consequences. According to industry data and statements from TSMC executives, building and operating a state-of-the-art fab in the United States costs roughly 30% to 50% more than building one in Taiwan. The labor is significantly more expensive, the regulatory compliance is incredibly dense, and the network of specialized chemical suppliers isn't physically there yet. This brings us to the dark, inescapable math of a post-WTO world. Redundancy costs money. Resilience costs money. If a corporation is forced by its government to abandon a highly optimized, hyper-efficient global supply chain in favor of a politically secure, locally sourced supply chain, the cost of production definitively goes up. And corporations do not absorb costs out of the goodness of their hearts. They pass them directly to you. Current macroeconomic models suggest that the unwinding of the WTO's globalized free trade system and the shift towards friendshoring will be fundamentally inflationary. We traded domestic manufacturing jobs for cheap flat-screen TVs in the 1990s and 2000s. Now, we're trying to buy that security and industrial capacity back. The price tag is going to be staggering. The World Trade Organization is not going to vanish tomorrow. The building in Geneva will stay open. Thousands of diplomats will continue to drink terrible coffee, argue over the precise legal definition of electronic transmissions, and file appeals into a permanently locked courtroom. But the institution is essentially a ghost ship. The actual power, the real momentum of global economics has already left the building. It has fractured into dozens of heavily fortified regional alliances, where trade is no longer viewed as a path to mutual global peace, but as a weapon of geopolitical leverage. So, What does this mean for your money, your job, and the future of the global economy? Let's wrap this up and look at the final, unavoidable verdict on the World Trade Organization. 9. The post-WTO world and your wallet. Let's bring this all the way back to the beginning. Let's look at the t-shirt you're wearing. For the last 30 years, that shirt was the product of a massive, heavily optimized $33 trillion spreadsheet. The World Trade Organization's ultimate goal was to make that shirt, and your phone, your car, and your food as cheap and abundant as humanly possible, regardless of where it came from. The underlying theory was that if everyone is getting rich selling each other cheap stuff, nobody will start a global war. And we have to apply our nuance rule here one last time. It worked. For 80 years, the multilateral trading system built in Geneva facilitated the most peaceful, economically explosive era in human history. It pulled over 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. It gave the West an unprecedented standard of living. It stopped World War III. We cannot look at the WTO as a complete failure, because the historical math simply doesn't support that. But it is obsolete. The system was built for a 1990s world where everyone generally agreed that free market capitalism was the only game in town. It was not built for a 2026 reality defined by Chinese state-sponsored mega corporations, invisible digital data, catastrophic climate change, global pandemics, and vicious superpower rivalries. So, what is the ultimate cost of the WTO losing its grip? Let the newest data provide the final shock value. Just days ago, in late February 2026, the International Monetary Fund and the European Central Bank released updated warnings on exactly what this new era of global trade fragmentation is going to cost us. Their economic models project that a severe fracturing of global trade into competing geopolitical blocs could wipe out up to 7% of total global GDP. And if you factor in the technological decoupling, like the US and China banning each other's microchips and software, losses in some economies could reach a staggering 12%. To put that in perspective, a 7% drop in global GDP is the equivalent of taking the entire economies of France and Germany and just wiping them off the map. That is the price tag of friendshoring. That is the cost of building dual supply chains, redundant semiconductor fabs, and retaliatory green tariffs. We are leaving an era of just-in-time hyper-efficiency and entering an era of just-in-case national security. The era of zero-inflation electronics and perpetually cheap consumer goods is, in all probability, mathematically over. The world is getting physically safer for sovereign governments, but it is about to get significantly more expensive for you. The WTO's appellate body will likely remain a locked, empty courtroom. The 166 diplomats in Geneva will keep frantically renewing temporary moratoriums on digital trade. But the true power over the global economy has already shifted back to where it was in the 1930s, into the hands of competing paranoid superpowers holding massive tariff hammers, daring each other to swing first. The referee is dead. The players are writing their own rules now. If this deep dive helped you actually understand the brutal mechanics running the global economy behind the scenes, hit the subscribe button. Also, the WTO is just one piece of the puzzle. Which invisible global institution should we completely tear apart next? Do you want me to decode the SWIFT payment system, or look at the mechanics of the Bank for International Settlements, BIS? Let me know your vote down in the comments. I literally build these videos based on what you guys want to understand next. Thank you for watching. Stay smart, stay skeptical, and I will see you in the next one.